I was initially machine piecing my quilts and sewing that initial patchwork together, mostly, with a sewing machine. And then I started to realize that I was having a lot more fun with the handwork part instead of the sewing machine part.
Welcome to Make and Decorate, a podcast for makers who love to sew, quilt, and decorate. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Make and Decorate podcast. This is episode 31, and we continue our series on the different types of quilting. And today's type of quilting is going to be hand quilting. All right, so before we get to all that, let's talk about some updates and what's going on here. First of all, I finally got the newsletter out. So for those of you who have subscribed, thank you so much too, because a lot of you have subscribed to the newsletter and I really appreciate it. So I got it done, and I just missed my end of June deadline by like 1 day or 2 days. But hey, it got done, and I was definitely motivated in making myself accountable to get that done. So I hope you enjoy the newsletter. Please send me any feedback you have. Make it nice feedback. If there's errors and that sort of thing, I definitely want to know. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it. A few things I did not keep myself accountable for that fell by the wayside were my 3 sewing projects I wanted to get done by the end of June for our vacation coming up this week. In fact, when you listen, or when this episode publishes on the 4th, it's publishing on the 4th of July. Happy Independence Day to America. But yeah, I'll be on the road driving to our vacation destination. So we're driving out east to the New York-Vermont border. Our cousins live in New York and right by the border of Vermont, and we're actually staying in Vermont, which is basically like 5-10 minutes away. So I asked the Airbnb person about quilt shops in the area, and she gave me 2. So I'm definitely going to check these out. One of them is the Waterwheel House Quilt Shop, and the other one is the Scarlet Creation. So if any listeners are in the Vermont, New York area, and you know about these quilt shops, let me know. And this is the other thing she gave me, which I'm so excited about. There is a Marimekko outlet. So I'm really excited about that. I'm definitely going to go see what's going on there. And yeah, it's going to be nice. I mean, I've been to Vermont about 5 years ago. And that was the first time I ever came to Vermont. And it is gorgeous. It is just picturesque, beautiful. They have everything basically. They've got like ski mountains in the winter, and they have just beautiful, like if you are into bicycling, there's people go there to do like bicycle trips because the landscape is so gorgeous. When we drive, there's this just picturesque part of the drive, and along the highway there are these just really long running shallow creeks with these beautiful rocks in there and tall, like craggy cliff type of, hills, mountains, and it's just so pretty to look at. So I'm looking forward to that a lot. So I really, really want to go to the Brimfield Flea Market in Massachusetts, but it is 2.5 hours drive away from where we're at. So I don't know. That's going to be like a last minute decision. Of course, no one wants to go. I'm the only one. See, this is what I'm talking about and what we all talk about. Like, everyone around us thinks that we're crazy, that we're just like, why would you want to go to a flea market? Why would you want to go to a fabric store on vacation? Because it's exciting to me. It's fun, and I always get some little trinket of a quilt shop where I go that is, not in my area. I mean, it's kind of fun. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it, and it should be fun. We're bringing Cooper, our dog. Cooper is the best travel dog. He has been traveling with us since he was 5 months old. We went on a road trip to Canada to visit my sister in law, and it's a 10-hour drive. And we weren't sure how he was going to do because we got him when he was 3 months old. And so we had only had him for 2 months. And, but we took him, and he loves the car. He loves to travel. He loves to be with us, and I think just since we adopted him from the shelter, he was just a cute little baby pup, and it was in the middle of winter, and we still even took him to this dog beach down by Lake Michigan. I mean, it's open year round, and in the winter, it's just there's still like the sand there, and the dogs love to run around in it. So he's been going to that since we've had him. That's his most favorite place in the world. He loves the dog beach all year round, and he just loves to go places. So we like to take him with us wherever we can. He's just so much part of our little family that it's just I just wouldn't want to leave him with a doggy hotel or whatever they call those things. So yeah. I did get the dog bed finished. That's the one project out of the three that I did complete. And it looks nice. However, I kind of rushed through it. I got it done in one day, and I just did not pay attention to details, and I just started making it. So I should have squared the top and the bottom pieces because when I put the filler, the foam, the Dacron wrapped foam inside the dog bed, the corners are a little wonky. You know what I did really well is the zipper in the banding. So I was really proud of that. And I think I am going to try to make this into a pattern because I like the design of it, and it really isn't that complicated. You just have to pay attention to the corners, and the top and the bottom pieces need to be the same size. And the reason these weren't the same size is because I pieced together different fabrics. So there's a larger middle piece, and then I cut up another fabric and put them on each end. It's a dog bed, and Cooper doesn't mind, and it's so cute. Okay, I just want to give a shout out to Pat Sloan, and she aired her last episode of her podcast that she has done for American Patchwork and Quilting for the past 10 years. Pat Sloan's podcast was the very first quilting related podcast that I ever found and listened to. And she has been such an inspiration to me, both as a quilter and a podcaster. So I really, really just want to send her all the best and to thank her for everything that she's contributed to our community in the podcast world. And she's not going anywhere. I mean, she's still running her business and doing her book writing and pattern writing and all of that. It's just that the editors of American Patchwork and Quilting have decided to go in a new direction, and they want their own editors to do the podcast. Okay, so it's time now to continue our series on the different types of quilting. Today's guest is Heidi Parkes. Heidi is actually from the Chicago area, like me, and she is a trained fine artist. She went to the Art Institute of Chicago, And her art now is quilting. She does a lot of mixed media and fiber arts with her quilting, and she has become very proficient and expert at hand quilting and hand mending. So I am just really pleased to present this to you. Here is Heidi Parkes. Welcome, Heidi, to the podcast. I'm so happy that you're here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
And today's topic on my quilting series is all about hand quilting, which is what you do.
Yes, it is. It's my favorite.
Yeah, I'm so excited to learn about this because I haven't really done too much of it. So I'm really excited to learn today. But before we dive into that, I just want to kind of get your story out there, kind of where your background. Like, I think you're from my area, like the Chicago area. Is that where you're
That is
from?
home for me. Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah. So I was born in the city of Chicago in a hospital and lived in Oak Park till I was 5 years old. And
Oh.
then I moved to Naperville, and that's where I did all of my growing up in the western suburbs of Chicago. And then I went to college in Chicago at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and then got a job as a high school art teacher. And I did that for 9 years in Naperville because that's where it was home and was really comfy. And I was actually able to live back at home with my mother for a while and pay her rent instead of a landlord that I didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually, when I decided to leave teaching to pursue quilting, I moved to Chicago for a year and lived downtown again. And then I've been in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for the last 4 years. And that's actually where my mother was born and where she's from. So it felt in many ways like going back home to the motherland.
Back to the origins.
Yes, exactly.
That's cool. Yeah, the whole, for the listeners where we're at, Chicago and the Wisconsin border are within an hour of each other. Milwaukee is just like, I don't know, not that far
It's an
off
hour
from
and
the
a half
border.
away.
From
It's so
Chicago.
close.
Right. It's very, very
Yeah.
close.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've been up there many times and I know all of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I'm in the town right next to Oak Park in Berwyn. So,
Oh, awesome.
yeah.
Yeah. And just this past weekend, I was visiting Oak Park. I'm a member of the Chicago Modern Quilt Guild,
Uh-huh.
and they meet in Oak Park. And so it's just such a fun thing to be able
Oh,
to go.
you went to that?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Oh,
I was at that
man.
meeting this past weekend.
I went to
And
that workshop on the day before.
we did.
Yes, with Liz
Wow,
Elliott.
yeah, exactly. I saw Liz Elliott give her lecture.
That's awesome.
So funny. We could have done this in person
I
instead
know,
of
right? Oh, man.
maybe next time.
You know what?
You'll just get into quilting and then you'll be at all the, deeper into quilting, you'll be at all the meetings.
Yeah, I joined the Chicago Guild last year, but then I didn't show up for like more than 3 meetings, and I felt bad. And then, but I was talking to them, and they're just like, "It's fine, just come when you can." And because I like the socialization and seeing everyone, so I think I will join again, in the new year. So.
What's nice is it's not that much more expensive than just being an at-large member of the Modern Quilt Guild,
Yeah.
which I, of course, want to do because I attend QuiltCon and I submit my quilts to that. And I'm a teacher at QuiltCon. And so I care a lot about the guild. And for a while I was hesitant. Oh, is Chicago too far away? Can I count as a guild member, even though I live in Wisconsin now? And they were so open and welcoming.
Yeah.
And it's such a great crew of people. And it really helps me feel rooted still in quote home to have good excuses like that to come back.
Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's a great group. I really loved it, and they
Yeah.
were, I'm an individual guild member now, but I found out there was an opening, and I'm like, could I come? And they're like, yes,
Yeah.
you're in. I was so excited.
Amazing. That's
Yeah.
so cool. I got to have a wonderful conversation with Libs about hand quilting. She's starting to do some hand quilting. It's been
Oh,
a few
good.
frame and rock her needle and all of that. And I was saying, oh, well, I quilt different from that, but it's still hand quilting. And
Cool. Yeah.
yeah,
And that's why I wanted to have you on. And I didn't want to exclude hand quilting from all the different types of quilting because people are doing it more and more often.
yeah, yeah.
And
It's awesome.
and what I've seen also is that um, even if they're not hand quilting the entire thing, they will embellish and hand quilt sections of the quilt or
Mhm.
highlight things. And I just love that because it
Yeah,
really gives some dimension and just a unique, personality to the quilt.
I agree. Yeah.
Good, good.
So to answer your question
Yeah.
more properly, when I was born, my grandmother organized a collaborative quilt, and my family and my mom's friends contributed to the quilt. Everyone made a block. And then my grandma finished it as a tie quilt, which is another kind of
Mm-hmm.
cool type of hand quilting. And so that is the way that I entered the world, was very much with a quilt
Oh,
and being surrounded by women who knew how to do all kinds of fiber art and needlepoint and applique and trapunto and embroidery and all the variety of techniques that are in this quilt. And my mom would always sew Halloween costumes for me and made a lot of my clothes growing up. But my mother was not a quilter. And so it took a while for me to decide that I wanted to make a quilt. And my mom was very active as an artist. And my grandmother also was an artist. She had a degree in art that she got in midlife and got me very interested in ceramics and in painting. And so in this very creative family that I grew up in, my mom and my grandmother were very interested in art and textiles and being able to sew, and just thinking that that was as important to learn as reading and driving. Of course, you know how to sew.
mm-hmm.
And my father was an amazing woodworker and very handy around the house. And so it was just this energy of let's do things by hand. Let's make things. And that was such an important culture in my family. And then I went to art school, as I mentioned, because I wanted to be a teacher. I was a theater kid in high school, and I loved being on stage and telling a story in an exciting way and sort of having that permission to have the spotlight, because I was oftentimes otherwise relatively shy. And then when I had the permission of the spotlight, whether through teaching or through acting, it was a very exciting moment. So when I was in art school, I initially thought how amazing it was to have access to a really big kiln
Mm.
and all the different toys and things. And so I thought, what else can I take as a class that will get me using cool technology? And I thought of metalworking because of the blowtorch and everything. And and so that is when the moment when I made my very first quilt ever was in my metalworking class in college. So that's my into the quilt world, which I think is not a very standard approach. But our assignment was make something that is as important on the inside as it is on the outside. And for me, that quilt from my family, the outside told a story and was interesting and beautiful and exciting, but the inside was the part that touched my body and gave me warmth and was the useful part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that equality of importance inside and outside for me was what drew me to the quilt. And so I used metal squares and also used squares of photos and books and textiles, and I sewed them together with wire, and it was murder on my fingers. I don't know
Mm.
what I was thinking. And then I made it soft on the inside, and it just lining it with a piece of fabric. And so that was my initial way into textiles. And it's what got me thinking that I had this huge background, this personal interest in textiles. And I had been working with clay by pressing lace and fibers and fabric into the clay and buttons. And everything I was doing was just on the edge of textiles. And so then I finally started incorporating textiles into my drawing classes and then ultimately taking fiber art classes when I was in college. And there in my quilting class, it was a class about sampling and the idea of making a sampler and also how does a DJ sample things and combine them. And so I made quilts out of books and paper and other non-traditional materials in that class, but all very handwork focused. I was making them by hand. I was not using big machinery to do any of this stuff. And then a lot of time passed while I was teaching and more focused on embroidery and that aspect of textiles. And then in 2013, when I moved out of my mom's home and into my own apartment and was doing my own thing, I had a quilt top from my grandmother that she had found at a estate sale. And my mom, as she was culling my grandma's things and trying to whittle her down to her smaller apartment, she grabbed that quilt top and said, Heidi, you should finish this and make it into a quilt to have in your home. I bet it would be really lovely. It's beautiful. And so that was the first quilt that I ever hand quilted that was made with fabric. And it is the greatest love story of my life because it was September 2013. And by the end of that month, I finished hand quilting the whole thing and was so in love with it. By the end of that school year, September is so perfectly the beginning of the school year. So by the end of that year is when I left teaching to pursue quilting full time. And it was this incredible year of hand quilting and watching and rewatching the documentary series Why Quilts Matter and going on Pinterest and Instagram and anything I could get my hands on to find out, can a person be a professional quilter? Is there a quilt world? How can I do more of this? Sewing with fabric.
And what did you find on that? Because that is a question that a lot of us have that are trying to make a living in the quilt world. And it's amazing that you went from September, if I heard this right.
Yeah.
September,
9 months.
you started hand quilting that quilt top that your grandmother gave you.
Yeah.
Finished it in a month.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of that school term,
Yes.
not even a year later,
Mm-hmm.
you pursued a career in quilting.
I did.
Wow.
And so, part of it that's important is it was my first fabric quilt, but back in around 2002 or 2003 is when I made that quilt out of metal. So a solid decade before. I was very skilled with using a needle. I had a lot of dexterity, a lot of skill with a needle. I simply hadn't applied it to quilting previously.
Right.
But some of the things that drew me to it was I had also been doing a lot of painting and I was feeling as though embroidery was so small. You put 20 hours into something and it's 5 by 7 inches. And how can you like, charge a reasonable amount for that thing, even though it took so much space? So I loved that quilts could be big. I loved that they were easier to transport and store in contrast to painting. I loved that the materials were, by contrast, they felt like they were free because each canvas is so expensive to buy. And I had plenty of fabric laying around from my family, from my neighbors, and the needle and thread were so easy to access. I already owned a sewing machine. The consumable parts of what you need to make a quilt were so much less. And also it was so clean and easy. I was leaving my mom's home where I had electricity set up to have a kiln. I had a whole huge basement where I could be painting. And suddenly in this new space, I needed to be much more clean and I could make a quilt in that space. Whereas I really couldn't figure out how to paint or do ceramics or other things in that space. And in terms of finding that courage to be a professional artist, a big part of it went back to when I was in high school and college. I worked as an assistant to a ceramic artist. And she had also gone to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago.
Mhm.
And I loved that as a job that I sometimes did. But in experiencing what it meant to be a ceramic artist, things were so fragile, they could break. In a second, you could chip something, and all the work that you had put into it is
Mhm.
completely gone.
Mhm.
And she had to drive a huge van in order to transport everything. It was a lot of heavy lifting. It was a lot of hours in the basement where you could have that kind of dust for clay. You can't work with pottery in your living room. And it it was eye-opening enough that I understood that people could be artists, but it was also an experience that let me know I didn't love ceramics enough to do the work that it took
Mhm.
to have that be my job. And when I made a quilt, I thought, I love everything about
Mhm.
this. It is worth the struggle and the difficulty. And certainly part of how I was able to do it is that I had been living pretty affordably with my mother and saving money for that, one day, who knows what I'll want to do. And so I had a significant amount of money saved up and I had paid off my student loans because I was living economically. And this felt like something I wanted that was worth spending that money instead of continuing to squirrel it away. And I also was from having been a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I don't know of any other college that does this. They have free ongoing support to all alumni forever. And so I was
Oh.
able to attend special free workshops that they had every other Saturday at the school. And each week, the theme was how to document your art with photography, how to do an elevator pitch, how to write your resume, how to do your website, how to have an online social media presence. All the time, just for free, I could access. And then
Oh.
also, they had one-on-one appointments that I could schedule at any time for an hour to meet with one of their about 10 different expert people. So I could look through their resumes, see what they were expert in, and meet with them for an hour to get personal advice on how to build and change my career as an artist.
Wow.
And it's amazing. And I have never heard of anyone else having access
No.
to anything remotely like that.
Ugh.
And so even though I graduated school in 2005, when we barely had the internet, when things were so different, I was able to go back. And the very first workshop of that kind that I attended was on a social media presence. And at the time, I had 250 followers on Instagram. It was a small collection of my Facebook friends, basically. And they completely transformed the way that I was thinking about how I was interacting with that social media. And within a year, I had 1,000 followers on Instagram. I'm super excited. I just recently hit 10,000 followers, and that feels like a really big
That's
step forward.
huge. That is so
And
huge.
it's so exciting. And it's because they changed the way that I was thinking about what I was doing.
Hmm.
And they also, one of the really powerful things that they did when I went in and met with them was I was starting to find people who inspired me. And so I went in and I showed them the website of Folk Fibers, Mara Grace Ambrose, and Luke Haynes,
Hmm.
and Pauline Boyd of Counterpane. And these three quilters were doing things that I thought were incredible. And I thought, if they can do some part of this, maybe I can do it too. And how are they doing it? And the expert that I went with, he said, first of all, let's look at what their splash pages and what their websites look like. Some of these people want to be in your home. They are making functional objects. On the other hand, some of these artists, because of the way they're doing their website, they want to be in a gallery. They are exhibiting fine art. Like if you didn't read the small little word that says quilt, you might think it was a painting based on the way that their website is structured.
Mhm.
And you've got to do some soul searching and think, where do you want to be? What is your identity? What is your goal as a quilter? And then when we looked past that, we looked at the small print of their website. So where was the tiny link with their CV? And how long have they been at it? Have they been quilting for a decade, for 2 years? And where did they get those first early breaks that helped them make their mark? And was it in a gallery? Was it in a textile shop? Was it through an interaction that they had with anthropology that was more of a mainstream designing connection? And those baby steps that they did early on in their career can help guide the early on choices that I make.
Mm.
And then also just kind of getting over some fears around approaching people. That was an exciting year where I was reaching out to some of those artists and saying, "Hey, I really love what you do. And can I collaborate with you? Can I have coffee with you sometime? Can we have a phone call online or meet over Skype?" And a lot of what I'm describing there is stuff that I did in that first year when I moved to Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
But the year when I was deciding what to do, it was really just about, I've finally found something I love. And also, I think a lot of us know that the job of being a teacher is changing dramatically in America.
Mm-hmm.
And I was driving between two different high schools, and it just, I felt like a frog in boiling water. I used to walk out of my job and think, I cannot believe that they pay me to do this. This is magic. Kids and art, nothing could be better. And it was slowly changing to the point that I was so frazzled and stressed with having 4 different budgets that I was buying things from and new acronyms each year and being told to teach classes that were supposedly the same as one another, but they really weren't the same as one another at all, with the same amount of time and what felt like twice the work. And so they were making it feel very easy to leave. And then also my duplex that I was living in, after 10 months of living there, the landlords decided they didn't want to be landlords anymore. And so I just realized, either way, I have to move. And it's such a nightmare. I did not want to move again. But I thought, okay, clearly the universe is saying that what I have been doing, it's going to be hard to stay. It's not going to be easy to stay. And here's this new way forward where I can move to Chicago, have a roommate, cut my living expenses, have lots of opportunities through my college, and can carve a new path that way. And so during that year, I made a collaborative quilt for my friend who was having a baby. And then I made a quilt that was a Christmas gift for my dad. And then I made a quilt that I thought was going to be a baby gift. And then I realized the person I was making it for, we weren't close enough for me to give her a gift that took that much time.
Right.
And I finished a quilt that my grandmother had in progress for about 30 years. And we gave that as a gift to my brother for his wedding. Oh. And then I thought, if I want this to be maybe possibly more fine art rather than functional craft, what would I make for that? And so I started to make a quilt that was a 36 block quilt about wanderlust and changing directions and moving and looking at the world differently. And that quilt went on in 2016 to win first place in handwork at the Modern Quilt Guild's QuiltCon.
Yes.
So it was a quilt that I called Places Unfold. And I was using a lot of embroidery in that quilt. And so all of the technical things that I had been doing in other corners of my creative life, it was the first time I thought, let me apply those skills to a quilt and have some of the artistic creative thinking that I have been bringing to painting. What if I put that into a quilt? And as I was starting to see that quilt form, it was great because with the 36 blocks, I could make a plan and then bring a block. And when I was doing supervision in the cafeteria as a teacher or proctoring exams. I could have that handwork with me, and it was small and easy to do. And then it came together to become a larger quilt. And as I was seeing myself make that quilt, it was just feeling more and more right that this is something I can do. I can really express myself in the medium of quilts. I'm not going to feel limited or pigeonholed into only the craft world and not the art world. My background with ceramics was so similar. Ceramics also has that deep history of being craft rather than fine art. And so I had that experience of seeing how certain mediums can straddle both worlds. And I was starting to see how a quilt could be in the fine art world just as easily as it could be in the craft world. And then I just jumped, I had been seeing a therapist during the time because I was going through some other transitions, and she helped me work through a lot of the fears that I had around finding the courage to be an artist and letting go of a salary and having my own health insurance. And luckily, Obamacare was on the scene by then, and I realized that I could have my own health care that would be true healthcare and not just catastrophic in case something terrible happens care. And then I jumped for it, and I felt so supported in that leap by the art school that I was in, and by the connections that I had in the creative world, and by the way that Instagram was just kind of new and getting started. And I was, for the first time, I could just send a DM, a direct message to Luke, and he would answer me back. And I'm sure a couple of years before that just wouldn't have been at all possible in my head that would happen. And that's still a true thing. People direct message me all the time, and I always get the message and I always reply. And what an amazing world we're living in right now, that we have access to reaching out to our creative heroes, and they'll write us back and give us advice.
Yeah, that is just a wonderful. Thank you so much for telling your story and about your journey, and just all of the roadblocks that you encountered, and also the way that you utilized resources out there that you had to make an effort to do that. And a lot of people, me included, are introverts, and it's hard for us to do that. But to have that resource from your college, the Art Institute, have that forever, I mean, and that's invaluable. That is just invaluable additional continuing education training. So I mean,
it's interesting because one of their struggles is that people don't take advantage of it.
Right. That's what I'm getting at.
These bi-weekly meetings I was going to, they were lucky if they got 10 or 15 people to show up. Sometimes there was only 6 people. And granted, there are different moments in a career when you need that kind of help. I feel as though, right now, because I did that, I don't really need that support currently. I'm not taking advantage of it as fully anymore because
you did it already.
I know. I mean, I already had probably 20 one-on-one meetings with them. How much more can I do? But it is really shocking to them that more people don't take advantage, and they're always trying to brainstorm, and then they came back to ask me and said, Heidi, how did we reach you? How did we get you to take advantage of this opportunity? How can we reach other former students and alumni and get them in the door? And so it's interesting that it does go both ways. And I think a lot of people, obviously there aren't that many people who went to the Art Institute, but there are lots of opportunities if you pause and look around yourself. Now that I live here in Milwaukee, I'm aware of lots of other kinds of opportunities that I'm eligible for. And it just takes a little extra digging on the internet to find that support, because there's so many different ways to get support like that. It's just that, the Art Institute was my way, and was, to me, the most obvious way in the first place to start.
That's amazing. I mean, it will never happen for me because my interior design school, Harrington, closed down last year. That was downtown Chicago. I
Oh,
know, I
oh, that's
know.
so
It is
sad.
so sad. Oh,
Yeah.
so now they're gone. But
Yeah.
oh
I
man,
think even, at the Art Institute, they have free lectures that are open to the public and that they have on a pretty regular basis where you can come in and see an artist talk about their work.
oh, I'm
And
going to get on their mail list then.
oh, they're so good. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and they had a bit of a lottery because it was so famous, but I saw Jeff Koons speak live in person.
Whoa.
In the textile arena, I saw Sonia Clark speak, and she does so many amazing things with hair and with deconstructing the Confederate flag. Picking, like unweaving
Yeah.
is part of her art form, and she's amazing. And I got to see her talk. And when I moved to Milwaukee, that was a really big early priority for me, was where can I see free art lectures? And so
Yes.
I went to the local art college that they have here, and I found out that they don't really do that. And and so then I dug a little deeper, and the state school, it's called UWM, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Their Peck School of the Arts has a weekly lecture that they don't meet quite, it's not open to the public quite every week, but probably twice a month I can go and hear a lecture. And again, there's always tons of space in the auditorium. It's like half full at the most. And it's so inspiring to be around that energy. And then the crowd of people who shows up there, and you go early and you sit in the front and then
Mm-hmm.
mingle a little bit, and you get to talk with other people who are also excited and striving and on this path of learning and taking advantage of the free resources in their community. And so then they'll tell me about something else that's happening. And did you know this art gallery has a free thing? Or did
Mm-hmm.
you know that someone else is doing something? And um, you know, please come to my opening for my art exhibition. And then let's
Mm-hmm.
do studio visits together. And being in communities like that, it
Mm-hmm.
really does spiral with opportunities.
Yes. And you are getting out there in real IRL
Yeah. And
with
then doing
meeting
Instagram
actual people.
went.
Right.
Hmm.
So that's the other plus about that
Hmm.
too. So this is wonderful. This is and people should check into their local college and art institutes and so forth. I mean, I'm so lucky to be here where I'm like 8 miles from the art institute. So
Oh,
I should get into that.
too, an interesting conversation within the craft and creative community is around unpacking the art world, that it can be intimidating or mysterious, and just kind of trying to know the difference of when is a quilt, when is a quilt a craft, when is a quilt art. Do I, as a quilter, also need to own the title artist? Maybe, maybe not. And I think there's so many times when people make quilts to express love and to have something in their home that they made instead of that was made in China and purchased at Target or Walmart. And just doing that is so beautiful and so interesting. And you don't have to wear that I'm an artist hat in order to own I'm a quilter who makes beautiful things for my own
Hmm.
home.
Right.
But if you are interested in that, in wearing that heart hat of artist, and you want other people to see your quilts and you want to participate in the art world, and you didn't go to art school, like most quilters, I would say, didn't go to art school,
Hmm.
how do you then begin to access that world that seems intimidating?
Hmm.
And I think that there are a lot of really powerful things that you can do to gain access. And part of that is watching documentaries like Why Quilts Matter, and also watching things like PBS Art 21. And you just start to see, how do
Yeah.
artists talk about their art?
And
How
Craft
do
in
they,
America.
oh, I love Craft in
Me
America.
too.
When I finally met Therese Agnew in person, I just, I almost died. I like could
Yeah.
have just swallowed her up
Oh.
with joy. Um, yeah, and so when you watch things like that, you learn how artists talk about quilts and
Mhm.
how artists talk about their work. And then you can go to free resources like lecture. Especially a lecture is so nice because everyone comes in and they sit down and you don't have to feel socially awkward about what do I do now?
Mhm.
How do I? And maybe you don't even talk to someone the first three times you go.
Sure.
You just observe and you feel yourself slowly becoming part of that community.
Right.
And then you attend an art gallery opening. And, again, maybe you don't have any pressure on yourself to talk to anyone at first, but you just show up and you just look. And it's one of those really safe social settings where you look completely normal. If you walk in and you don't say anything and you drink a little wine,
Mhm.
eat a bite of cheese, and look at the art, and then you go home. And then once you feel comfortable doing
Mhm.
that, maybe you say hi to someone. Maybe you introduce yourself to the artist.
Mhm.
Maybe you give someone the little elbow or comment like, I don't get this one. Do you get
Right,
it?
right.
Or wow, that's so beautiful. How did they do that? Do you know? I can't tell. And it's those baby steps that
Mhm.
give us access. And I
Yeah.
think it's really important that if we as quilters want to be part of the art world, we need to show up in and participate in the
Mhm.
art world. And that is
Yeah.
step number one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's not a step that anyone has to take, but it's a really easy step if you want to take it.
Right. Right. Absolutely. That's great. You are just a wealth of information and resources about this. This is wonderful. So then now let's get into more of the hand quilting part.
Yeah.
And I mean, I one of my questions was like, why do you have such a passion for it? But I think you've already gone there. I can, I know why you have a passion for this art now, and with your family history and your community, and just, you said experiencing other types of art, and then this one really, grabbed you.
It
So,
feels so
yeah.
good to make a quilt.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice way to spend my time.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that it has a history that's connected to women. I feel
Mm-hmm.
as though every time I have a personal win in my own microcosm as an artist supporting myself,
Mm-hmm.
it is also a macrocosm win for women getting recognition and for our traditional art forms
Mm-hmm.
being supported and valued. And it makes me feel good. And
Mm-hmm.
I really love that about it and about
Mm-hmm.
quilting.
Yeah,
But it's
absolutely.
mostly it's selfish. It just
Yeah,
feels really nice.
I know it does.
And also I think, same as some people are great at catching a ball or they're great at learning a foreign language.
Mm-hmm.
I think I just have some natural inherent skill where needle arts makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
The same way for someone else, they look at a car and it just makes sense to them. They
Mm-hmm.
understand how to fix it. They understand how to do an oil change. I get textiles
Yes.
and it's fun for me because of that.
Right. And what's also nice about it is that you are very giving with your knowledge and you teach it. So I
Yeah.
think that's wonderful because I'm always learning. I will always learn forever.
Hmm.
And, this is another form of quilting that I want to learn and get into.
Yeah.
And you do teach workshops.
Hmm.
What else do you teach?
So I've got a workshop coming up through the Modern Quilt Guild at QuiltCon. And that one is on visible hand piecing. And for me, it's an extension of why I love hand quilting. I I never even thought about machine quilting. It didn't occur to me. But I was initially machine piecing my quilts and sewing that initial patchwork together, mostly, excuse me, with a sewing machine.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to realize that I was having a lot more fun with the handwork part instead of the sewing machine part.
Hmm.
I didn't like how straight I had to sit. It hurt my back a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't like listening to the sound of the sewing machine because I couldn't as easily have a podcast or an audiobook or a TV show on in the background. So I thought, how can I get rid of this and have it be worth doing? Because I had the misconception that if I was to start hand piecing my quilts, they would look the same as something that was machine pieced. And how could I justify spending all that extra time for something that wouldn't show up in my art?
Mm-hmm.
And what I was able to learn is that there are a lot of ways that hand piecing can be visible. One of the really powerful experiences that I had is I went to Seoul in South Korea in 2015 and visited my favorite roommate from college.
Oh.
And she had been begging me to come visit her for a decade. And I thought, now I can get, two birds with one stone. I can learn about Korean patchwork and I can see my friend Young Oak. And the, in that tradition, they use a whip stitch, and it's not like the whip stitch that we use with English paper piecing or grandma's flower garden doing hexagons. In those Western traditions, there's a lot of cheating the needle to the back, using thin thread, invisible, matching colored thread.
Mm-hmm.
And the Korean patchwork tradition, you use a bright colored silk, and it transforms the act of making a patchwork from being an exploration in shape to being an exploration that also includes line, because suddenly then you can see very vividly the line that is the space where those two shapes meet and where they're being connected. And learning those techniques and then slowly digesting them. It took me about 9 months from going to Korea before I was able to make my first quilt where I incorporated that into the piecing.
Oh, wow.
But now I also use a lot of running stitch for applique things, and I'll use applique techniques when I'm piecing things that are bigger than an applique setting. And because of that, you can see the handwork. And I think then that is where it becomes beautiful enough that it's worth doing.
Right.
And also, certain seams and things we avoid a lot in machine piecing because it's hard. Even something simple like a curve, but also an L seam or a Y seam.
Mm-hmm.
It's so easy when it's this applique hand piecing approach. It's so hard when you're trying to shove it through a sewing machine and you hope it'll lay flat at the end. So there are both disadvantages and advantages to the hand piecing that I am really excited about. So that is a 6-hour class that I'll be teaching at QuiltCon. That's going to go live. Oh, I don't know when people can sign up for that, but it's a hot second that the classes are available and then they sell out.
Oh, is that going to be in Austin next year?
Yes, exactly.
Oh.
That'll be with QuiltCon in Austin next year.
All right.
And so that's a really exciting extension of handwork. If you like hand quilting, you might also like visible hand piecing, and that's something that I'm really excited about teaching.
Oh, fantastic.
And then I have a variety of other classes that I teach that are on handwork. Last year at QuiltCon, I did a lecture on hand quilting, and I had a lot of details about that. And another handwork-based passion of mine is mending. And I'll be teaching a class soon with the Makery out in Boulder, Colorado. The class will be at the end of October, and our sign-up is going to go live probably in early June, I think.
Cool.
And so for that, I'm teaching about mending, and that, again, is something that I just love how it looks when it's done by hand. I think that our society can really get behind the idea that time is money. We understand that time is the most valuable thing that we have. And sewing is such a unique, amazing art in that a sewing machine cannot replicate what a hand stitching with a needle can replicate. They don't look the same.
Mm-hmm.
You have a dotted line by hand and you have a straight line by machine. And so when someone looks at a garment that's been mended by hand and they see that dotted line, even if they don't sew themselves, they still generally have the wherewithal to know that that looks different from the clothes that they buy
Mm-hmm.
that are made by a sewing machine.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you see it and you think, oh, that's stitched by hand. Time is money. That must be beautiful. That it, that it's as though it's been repaired with gold or something that you want to look at. That
Mm-hmm.
is then a focal point or a centerpiece
Mm-hmm.
in the garment, rather than a mistake or an apology or something that you're trying to hide. I think so many times something we need to avoid when we're mending is that feeling of embarrassment, as
Mm.
though your bra strap is hanging out or your underwear is showing. And the things that you can see, but you think maybe I'm not supposed to be able to see that. That's where it becomes, I think, a little bit embarrassing. And if you can make amend and have it appear purposeful, then people see it and they realize, okay, I'm allowed to see this and I'm allowed to recognize that it's beautiful and interesting. And so the class that I'm teaching is going to be a 3-day retreat where people bring a great big stack of clothing and we plow through everything, every kind of mend, every type of woven or knit fabric. I wear a lot of leggings, partly because one of my jobs is that I'm a yoga instructor. And it's hard to find a comfortable pair of leggings. I know they appear comfortable on the outside, but there's the scourge of the saggy crotch where I'm always pulling them up,
Yes.
and things that are too tight or they don't fit right or the waistband is in the wrong place. And so when I find a good pair of leggings, those are really special to me. And I've
Mm-hmm.
developed a lot of mending techniques to help keep them alive, the pairs
Mm-hmm.
that I really love. And so all of that kind of stuff is going to be covered in the workshop and it'll all be done by hand. And I'll say too, something really exciting for me is there are lots of quilting classes that exist within the quilt world, like what you took through the Quilt Guild.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they're hosted. And I feel as though I'm one of a few special people who get to teach quilting within the maker movement and within other spaces. Because in order to hand quilt or hand piece or mend by hand, you don't have to own a sewing machine. You don't have to own a rotary cutter and a mat. That you just need a needle and thread and a thimble. And I don't even quilt with a hoop. I just like to use a heavy book on the edge of a table, and I use that to create tension. And it doesn't take much. And so then it's low stress for people to say, well, I'll just dabble in quilting. I'll try it once.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe if I really like it, I'll invest in a sewing machine and things later on. But I think to date, there have been some things that for people who didn't grow up in a home like I did with a sewing machine, it's hard for them to dip their toe in the quilt world.
Mm-hmm.
It's so intimidating and it's so expensive, and there's all this stuff you have to understand. And when it's a handwork quilting class, it suddenly becomes accessible again. And a novice and a beginner and someone who's not already into quilting can take a class and feel super successful.
That's true. Definitely. It eliminates a lot of the ancillary multiple tangents that are out there in the world of quilting. There's so much of it. But you were talking about tools like you don't use a hoop, because I that's kind of what I know. I wanted to know because I do see people quilting in hoops and or frames. And I'm just not sure, what is appropriate for when. But it sounds like really whatever you need is what you need.
Um,
Whatever's comfortable for you is what you need.
yeah, yeah. Whatever's comfortable for you, but I would extend the caveat of what's comfortable and healthy for your body.
Right.
Because there are a lot of things that people initially do when they start quilting that are not healthy for their hands.
Mm.
And you want to be cautious of that. The top thing that I see is people think it's awkward to use a thimble. They feel a bit like all thumbs,
Mm-hmm.
kind of the same way that we as children felt about using a pencil instead of a big, thick crayon. You have to then learn how to hold the pencil in a way that's healthy for your hand.
Mm-hmm.
And the thimble can feel awkward at first, but it has a very important job. And so if you're not using a thimble, what you're doing is you're squeezing this very tiny thin needle between your fingers. And with that pressure where you're squeezing on the sides of it, you're trying to push it through something. And you might feel okay doing that for a few hours at a time or even for a couple months. But at a certain point, the calluses that builds up on your hand are going to be problematic. And having that kind of pressure of finger against finger and metal, that can cause damage to your nerves and your hand.
Mm.
The logic behind using a thimble is that would be either on your middle finger or your ring finger. Both are good. That completely just depends on what's comfortable for you.
Mm-hmm.
But and there are also interesting thimbles that actually rest on the palm of your hand. If you look into sashiko quilting or sashiko embroidery
Mm-hmm.
from Japan, there's a tradition of having it. So there are many different kinds and shapes and thimbles and many ways to use them.
Oh, I think I have that one. It fits
It's
on
like
your, it's almost like
it's
a
a ring.
ring, but it's
hmm
got it right here. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a ring that rests underneath
Mm-hmm.
the joint on your
Yes.
finger.
Yeah.
And all thimbles are good. All thimbles do the same thing. They give you something to push against so that the fingers that are holding the thimble just need to lightly grip it and keep it in place.
Mm-hmm.
The pushing, that intense pressure that it takes to bring the needle through the fabric, that comes from the thimble. And so that is a very important thing that you do want to train yourself to do because you don't want to have damage in your hand.
Very
You
good.
also, with your thimble, you want to be careful that it's not too tight.
Mm.
I personally really like the thimbles that are softer.
Mm.
So I love the Clover Protect and Grip thimble. It's a soft silicone around my finger, and it's just hard metal at the tip.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
There are also a lot of great thimbles out there that are made from leather. I personally haven't found one that I love that works with my shaped fingers. I have very long, skinny fingers, just like my dad's side of the family. So, everything is tailored. If you've got fingers that you were told you should play the piano as a kid, then what I do might be the right choice for you. But if you have a different kind of finger, I have no idea what shaped thimble will be your preference. But I do
Right.
know that it's worth buying a few different thimbles,
Mm-hmm.
playing with them and seeing what's right. But I love the idea of using a leather thimble because it's a natural renewable resource and it is soft rather than hard against your.
Yeah, and
So,
I have a leather one too. That one doesn't work for you. It might be made by Clover, but it's kind of like a white or gray leather, and it kind of has a little bit of
oh yeah, no, I don't
gathering.
like that one. Yeah,
No?
no, do not like that
Oh.
one. It's too big and clunky for
It
me
is a little
because
boxy
it has
at the
a
fingertip.
metal. And
Mm-hmm.
I like to push from the tip of my finger
Aha.
rather than the pad of my finger.
Oh,
And that
gotcha.
symbol, I believe, is meant for pushing from the pad of your finger.
Yes, that's
Um,
what I've done.
Similar to the nimble is a black one, and it has a little piece of metal embedded in it. And again, that's a pad pushing rather than a tip
Gotcha.
pushing situation.
Okay.
And then there's another nice one that's a thicker leather where it's one flat kind of U-shaped piece of leather, and then the other piece of leather, just like a shoe, is sort of curved around to match that. It looks a
Okay.
lot like a shoe, like a claw for your finger.
Okay.
And that one, I don't like the rough ridges where the seam is, but I like that it's thick enough leather that you don't have to have the metal embedded anywhere. You're just pushing.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, there's a
Right.
lot of intricate details in the thimble world, and just please use one. I have no
Exactly.
opinions beyond that. Just please use the thimble.
Right.
And so then for me, with some other material choices that
Mm-hmm.
are important to me in Western quilting that uses thin thread, that's where the quilting hoop and frame has a lot of popularity and tradition. And in that instance, it's a super short needle to go with your super thin thread. And that is all about rocking your needle back and forth. And that's how you catch your stitches. And then you pull through, and you only do a couple stitches per pull of the needle. What I find with what I'm working in is I like to use thick thread again because I want people to see
Yes.
that I did it by hand. That for me is a real guiding principle in my work. I want my handwork to be visible.
Yes.
And so then if I'm looking, for example, at sashiko embroidery from Japan, that's very precise art and that's an embroidery technique. But there are things to be learned about using thick thread, in particular, that they rock the fabric and apply it to the needle, and the needle is resting in their palm, and then they have lots of stitches per pull.
Okay. Yeah, because
Similar
the needle
in,
is long too.
yeah, it's
The
very
Sashiko
long.
needle.
It's
Mm-hmm.
a very different needle.
Mm-hmm.
Also in India, they have kantha quilting, and that tradition is done with a larger needle, and the quilt is sometimes just laying on the floor and they're passing by it.
Hmm.
And it's a stitch that's meant for speed, so they do lots of stitches quickly rather than carefully doing a few stitches.
Okay.
And the cantha stitch is beautiful because the back of the quilt, it's just this tiny little nick. The stitch maybe a millimeter or a 16th of an inch long.
Okay.
And then the front of the stitch is perhaps even a solid quarter of an inch. So they're rocking their needle, they're moving the needle very quickly through.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the thread is actually buried in the quilt itself because they're sewing at such a diagonal rather than bringing their needle perpendicular to the quilt. And so that's a really interesting art form. I would love to know more about it. I'm going to India in September, and so I'm really hoping that the same way that when I went to Korea and I really learned about that tradition, I'm hoping I can really learn more about how a needle is held properly and all of those details in kantha quilting.
Cool.
But I think something important there is that, again, they're not using a hoop at all. And so then when I went to begin using thicker thread for my quilting, I thought I'm making things that look more like these other traditions and that don't bear any resemblance to a tiny thread perforation mark quilt. And so, but I did need some tension. I felt like I could really use a third arm. And so that's where, for me, I lay my quilt on a table and then I place a heavy book. I used my scale and measured. My book is about 5 pounds, and it's a book that my dad gave me about women artists. So I like that that is my largest book that I own. And I put that on top of my table, and then I work in the space that's off the edge of the table. So I'm not working right in front of the book on top of the table. I'm working off the ledge of the table, and I can pull tight on that and create some tension with my left hand. And then with my right hand, I can hold my needle relatively still. And with my left index and thumb, I'm able to rock the fabric because I don't want that ratio that's in a kantha quilt. What I want is a stitch that's exactly the same on the front and the back. I just personally find that satisfying, and that is the only reason why I do that. And And I also like the freedom that depending on how complicated the direction of my quilting is, I can quilt from the front or I can flip it over and I can quilt from the back.
Mm.
And in both instances, my stitches look the same.
Right.
And for me, that has some real advantages for the way that I like to work and the different patterns and improvisational lines that I like to do with my hand quilting. So it's much more though rocking the fabric rather than rocking the needle. And if I were confined by a hoop, the fabric would be too taut and I wouldn't be able to rock the fabric.
Okay.
What I also do that I like is I stack a lot of stitches on my needle. I use a milliner's needle. I like the Dritz brand. They have a multi-pack, and I like to use the 3 smallest of the 4 needles from that pack. And I love that it is sharp, that it is long, that it is resistant to being bent, although I certainly have bent a couple of them from when I'm working. And then the thing that I appreciate about it the most is that it is the eye of the needle is the same thickness as the length of the needle. Embroidery needles are tempting to use with thick thread, but I found that makes pulling the needle through the fabric that much harder. It's really a lot of pressure on my fingers, on my elbow, on my shoulder. And so by using, it's slightly more challenging to thread, but once you get the hang of it, you thread it once, you pull it through so many times. And I would rather have that pulling moment be less effort, less taxing on me. And so with my milliner's needle, I'll stack probably 2 to 4 inches worth of stitching on my needle. It's all bunched up on there. And then I'll pull. So I'm getting about 3 inches of quilting every time I pull my needle through. And that is really helpful for me. I feel like I'm being economical with my time in that way. And I like to use a rubber gripper on either my thumb or my index. I kind of like to take turns so that both of them alternate. If I have that on both fingers, I feel like I'm all thumbs. I can't, I don't have enough dexterity that way. But having that gripper on just one of those fingers is enough tension that makes it a little easier for the pulling side. So I've got my metal, nice strong thimble on my, I prefer ring finger, but I try to make myself alternate between my ring and my middle again, so that I'm not doing the same exact movement over and over and over again. The more I can create diversity of movement, the less taxing that is on my body. So I'm pushing with my thimble, and then I'm using the aid of my rubber gripper to pull through. And I'm also, as I pull, something that I learned for my health of my shoulder is that I don't want to lift my hand up higher than my shoulder when I'm pulling. It's much better to reach forward and away, keeping my hand at shoulder height or lower when it's that intense, repetitive movement. So sometimes if I'm using a long thread, I'll actually pull away from myself and then catch the thread on my elbow and then pull my elbow away.
Oh, all right.
Hopefully the audio of that is translating to our listeners, but that it's helpful to not reach up overhead all the time. It's helpful to reach forward and around, or to catch the thread on my elbow and pull back towards so that that right arm isn't going higher than my shoulder. And again, it's less frequent if I'm able to stack a lot of stitches and then pull once every 3 inches instead of once every inch or every half inch. But all of those choices are based on the thread that I like. And so the thread that I like is DMC pearl cotton size number 8.
Oh, okay. 8.
I love that thread. So much. I initially went to the craft store and I saw the beautiful colors in the DMC floss for embroidery. And I thought, oh, I'll make a quilt with that. And I did make a couple quilts with that. And it was very frustrating because those 6 strands, invariably, one of the strands will pop out more than the others. And then it just doesn't look right. And it also doesn't hold a knot very well. I was having trouble with my knot slipping open. So the DMC pearl cotton is mercerized, and all of the strands that make that thread are spun together in a way that they can't be pulled apart. And that makes it smoother to work with, and also it holds a knot better. So I love that thread, and I like that thickness and the way that it is spun and wrapped around. I also, if I want something slightly thicker, or if I just want a color that's different, or if I want to be gentler on my pocketbook, the other thing that I really like is crochet yarn. So something, for example, like Aunt Lydia's, although I don't have as strong of feelings about the brand. So it could be the Michaels brand crochet thread. It could be the DMC brand crochet. For me, it's about color when it comes to that. And that is also mercerized and slightly thicker. So it's a slightly more visible stitch. It's really inexpensive thread. It's so affordable, especially if you use a coupon. So those two are my hands down favorite things to use because of the color variation and the way that it's mercerized. And it's a nice strong thread. If you start cutting corners on thread and buying the cheap stuff, or buying other brands that are prioritizing other virtues in their thread, like sometimes those threads get really thin and they'll snap, like they'll break before I'm done using the thread. So that's why I like the DMC and the crochet stuff, is that it's strong and good colors and mercerized.
Yeah, and cost effective, because, and this is a really good tip about the crochet yarn, because I didn't know about that. And I really like the Aurifil threads, and they've got a beautiful 12 weight thread, which probably would be good for that, but
it's thinner.
Oh, is it?
I have a ton of thread like that from Sulky, because I've won some awards and they've given it to me as a prize.
Cool.
So I have the most beautiful colors in that 12 weight. And I try to use it when I can for embroidery things. And when I'm mending, if I'm mending something that's more delicate, then I like that thinner thread.
Oh, good. That's a good use for it.
For me, it's just not visible enough.
Gotcha.
And in order for the stitch to look, there's something about matching your stitch length with the thickness of the thread. And I find in order for the 12 gauge to look right and not sloppy, I need to make my stitches smaller.
Okay.
But other people, go other ways. My dear friend Zach Foster, who I so love the way that he hand quilts, he thinks that upon my advice, he bought some size 8, and then later he gifted it to me because he said it was just too thick and he couldn't deal with it. He wants his size 12.
To each their own.
Very intimate decision process.
Yes.
And, if you buy some stuff that's the wrong diameter, hopefully you can find a friend who likes it.
Right. But this is a good guide just for people who just want to try it. And I also want to say that for listeners that are used to doing fast and quick projects, that this hand quilting slows you down, makes you really present with your project and think about it, and don't think about, I don't have time for this, or if a lot of people are just like, oh, I don't have time for that, I just run it through and done. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's the lifestyle you have. Maybe you have little kids or whatever, but maybe you don't do a whole quilt of hand quilting and just put a little bit of it in there. But I just
Or
think
maybe
it's
you make
something to
something
try.
other than a quilt, right? Maybe you
Yeah.
make a purse or a
Uh-huh.
placemat,
Right.
or make a jacket for yourself or some
Yeah.
kind of clothing. Maybe you make a 3 foot by 3 foot baby quilt.
Mm-hmm.
Don't start with a king size
Yeah.
quilt for your bed, that's for sure.
Right.
Hmm.
But this is a really good and talking about the mending, I've definitely gotten into that more in the last 6 months, learning about it. I follow the hashtag.
Visible mending.
Oh, I didn't. Not that one. I don't.
Oh,
I'm going to
loved clothes last.
visible mending. No, the mend and make do.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one too.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But I'm gonna hashtag visible mending. But the things that I see on that feed is amazing.
Yeah.
I am just blown away by this mending that these people do. And they make it so artistic. And to me, it's just like you just made a couture custom piece of clothing
Yeah.
right there. It is
Hmm.
that good. It's just so amazing. So that's why I've been following it, and I learned I learned about this little speed weave mini loom.
Oh.
And I love, you put the little hooks and you weave the yarn or the thread through it and you swish them the other direction and they
Hmm.
create like this weave. So I've been on like this hunt for it, but man, they are expensive. It's just the going
Oh.
rate for those are in like the $200 to $300, and I'm just like,
Or just a simple.
what? Yeah, for a little piece of round wood and a row of little metal hooks. It's just crazy. They did that with the quilters with the featherweight sewing machine. Now that's
Hmm.
exorbitant. It's just the
Oh, yeah.
supply and
No.
demand.
I'm thinking maybe you could use an embroidery hoop and some applique needles
Yeah.
in between and make your own little
I know, right? I got
piece
to
of
get creative.
cardboard. The high school art teacher in me is like, "Oh, don't we use shoe boxes to make a loom?"
Right, right. Yeah,
How
yeah.
about your cottage cheese lid?
There you go.
Hmm.
Get creative. But yeah,
I think both of these things harken back to a similar mindset of quality over quantity
yeah.
as well. And why do you need to be able to make a quilt in 10 hours? That, I
Hmm.
don't know why you would need to make that. I think for me, just the quilting part of it, making something that's around 3 feet by 3 feet is probably just 20 hours of hand quilting. If I'm making something that's 5 feet by 5 feet, that would be potentially around 36 hours of hand quilting. And how much time have all of us spent watching Game of Thrones?
Right.
uh, if a season of a show is 10 hours,
Yeah.
think about how many seasons you're willing to watch.
Right.
And quilting is something that is it's very easy to watch TV and quilt at the same time. You don't need to be eyes glued to your work the whole time. I think that's, for me, the thing that's time consuming is knitting and crocheting.
Hmm.
If I'm going to knit myself a shirt or something, that's the long term just for me. I would never sell that to anyone because
Right.
it's too much time. But both of those art forms, I can knit and watch a show, I can quilt and watch a show, and then it becomes, well, yeah, I can marathon through a TV thing. My first quilt that I made, I distinctly remember that I was watching Fringe on Netflix as I
Mm.
was hand quilting in September 2013. And by the time I finished watching Fringe, I had a quilt. And it was great because it was this suspenseful TV show where I just always wanted to watch the next episode, next episode. And then I was able to finish that quilt in a month. And
Yeah.
it's a good way to wrap your brain around the time that you're spending on the thing. I think when I'm mending, I'll consider to myself, is this a sitcom? Is this a drama being 30 minutes or an hour? Is this, a movie length mend?
Mm-hmm.
We're not talking about marathoning Game of Thrones when we're talking about mending. We're talking about, 2 hours, four
Mm-hmm.
hours, maybe a whole day for something that's really special.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we can find that time, especially if we start unpacking where our time goes for the other things that we do. If
Sure.
I want to buy a brand new pair of pants, let's say, I need to first go to work and earn money. Then I need to think about, where am I going to shop? Am I going to go to the mall or am I going to go online? And in both places, I have to hunt around a little bit and try things on at the mall or read the reviews on the store's website. And then I get it home and then I try it on with my other clothing. And then most of the time I like it and I keep it. But plenty of times, especially if I bought it online and saved time with going to the store, then I have to deal with returning it.
Yes.
And then, because we're in this consumer culture where we don't have space for all of our stuff,
Mm-hmm.
sooner or later, everything that we add to our closet, we have to find something else to remove. And
Mm-hmm.
so we have to either follow that rule when we come home from the store, or we have to have a huge purge where we see what sparks joy in our closet and get
Right.
rid of things. And that is a lot of time. And I'll wager that it's more time than watching TV for an hour or having a glass of wine with my friends in the evening and having everyone over for snacks and mending.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly know which way I would prefer to
Mm-hmm.
spend my time.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
it's a lot of just changing our thinking around the way that we're spending time,
Mm-hmm.
because we have so many habits around consumer culture that we're not even aware of the
Mm-hmm.
time that goes into participating in that system.
Mm-hmm.
And once we do become aware of it and draw back from it a little bit, it's really shocking
Mm-hmm.
when
Yeah.
when we try to reintroduce ourselves. And I got a gift card as a Christmas present to a store, and I like haven't been able to spend it yet. It's so frustrating because I've been looking online, and now I have to return the things online, and I'm living that right now. I'm in the nightmare of trying to spend money at a store.
Yeah. Very good. That's a really good way of looking at that and really seeing where your time goes
Hmm.
with that. So I'm looking forward to learning more about mending. And if anyone's interested about with that 3-day mending, where is that retreat at actually? At the
It is
makery.
in Boulder, Colorado,
Oh, okay.
and the website is the Makery. Make Oh God, I
I
can't
have it
spell that at all.
Makerie.
Yes,
Okay.
that's how it's spelled.
I'll put it in my show notes. I'll put a link to it
Hmm.
when you get that, and because this is not going to go up for a few weeks, so we'll have time to do that. But yeah, I'll have that up there for anyone who wants to dive into that retreat. That sounds wonderful.
It is
One other thing
so.
though, I wanted to address before we moved on. The batting
Yeah.
type. Is there
Oh,
any special
I
batting?
like I like warm and natural batting from the Warm Company. And I used to say that I didn't have a great reason for liking it. I mean, like my milliner's needles and my thread and my thimble, that is seriously researched, impressive. I feel very confident recommending that. And I would
Uh
always
huh.
say, well, I've only ever used warm and natural batting and I can't complain, but I don't know. And the reason I bought it was because I was looking at Joanne Fabrics and everything else seemed to have glue in it. It was
Mm.
all this fusible, weird
Mm-hmm.
chemical stuff. And especially because I'm hand quilting, I don't want a needle that's passing through all those chemicals on my skin, getting absorbed through
Mm-hmm.
through my skin that way. So
Mm-hmm.
number one, I like warm and natural because it has natural ingredients in it, like
Mm-hmm.
cotton instead of glue.
Right.
But at QuiltCon this past year, I attended an amazing lecture about cotton and the history of cotton. And in that lecture, I learned that Warm and Natural is one of the unique brands that actually uses American-made cotton.
Hmm.
And so I feel great about buying American cotton.
Yes.
The guideline cotton is actually a very controversial material. I mean, as are most materials.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to feel good about things like mending, there's a documentary called The True Cost. And that documentary on Netflix will make you cry and be grateful for even the one time that you decided to mend something or buy less instead of more.
Mm-hmm.
And in there, they talk about the cotton industry and all of it's like cotton candy to bugs. And so there are a lot of chemicals used. And in America, we have some stricter guidelines on how to apply those chemicals so that farmers aren't dying
Mm.
from the chemicals that they're using to make the normal cotton as opposed to organic cotton.
Okay.
And in other countries like India, they are making a lot of cotton there, but they don't have the strict human guidelines.
Mm.
And there's also a lot of problems that they highlight in that film around people buying the seeds and the equipment and the chemicals, and then at the end of the season, they owe a certain amount of money back because they got into debt to get the chemicals. And if it was a bad year, if for any reason their crops didn't grow, it's completely devastating to that family
Mm.
and their finances. And they highlight in their problems with suicide that the farmers are having
Wow.
because they had a bad year with their crops and there's no way to get out of that crippling debt that they have because of the chemicals. So
Yeah.
cotton is complicated,
Mm-hmm.
as it has been. Certainly, cotton, we think of America and we think of slavery
Mm-hmm.
and the intensely complicated history that it had then, and it continues to be
Mm-hmm.
complicated. I would say it's still, in many ways, better than polyester because that has all the microplastics that are
Mm-hmm.
going to the ocean every time we wash them in our washing machine. Um, like all of these
Mm-hmm.
materials are complicated.
And even
And,
bamboo. People think that
uh-huh.
bamboo is so renewable and eco. And I found out that the processing that goes along with making bamboo batting is, they're
Mm,
reversing it. They're reversing all the ecological, pros by
wow,
filling all the chemicals in the plants that processes the bamboo.
that's interesting. I imagine it's
Yeah.
a lot like rayon, where
Yes.
it is a natural fiber, but
Mm-hmm.
it's a heavily altered
Yes.
natural
Yeah.
fiber. And so they all have pluses and minuses.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, one of the biggest things to keep in mind is if you're going to acquire some of those things,
Mm-hmm.
try to make it last
Right.
rather than throwing it out after a season.
Mm-hmm.
Like try to see it as the valuable thing that someone struggled
Mm-hmm.
to grow and to bring into the world.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
so anyways, I feel now remarkably good about my lifelong choice behind warm and natural batting.
Great.
I like that it's from America
Me
where we have
too.
higher standards for the human side
Yeah.
of that equation.
Yep.
And the batting that I get is needled batting. And traditionally that's needled into a scrim. And so part of that scrim is made from something synthetic and being needled. It's like it's being felted.
Mm-hmm.
It fuses the batting so it doesn't come apart and shift inside of the quilt.
Mm-hmm.
It also keeps it flat. Now the Warm company who makes Warm and Natural, they have another line that they're making where even the scrim is made out of cotton.
Mm.
And so that's something new that I've personally been excited about buying, but haven't really, um, because making quilts is slow, I haven't
Mm-hmm.
made very many quilts with it
Mm-hmm.
yet, but
Sure.
it seems to function in a way that's just as good. But it is truly 100% cotton,
Okay.
versus having that scrim that is made from a different material,
Right.
but certainly no glue involved.
Yes. Good. Very good. Well, You know what? I definitely want to have you back because there's just so much more to just find out from you because we didn't even get to talk about just the inspiration for your work of like the Japanese wabi sabi, and you talked a little
Mhm,
bit about the Korean. How do you say
mhm.
it? Jogato,
Jogakbo.
Jogato,
Yeah, jogak.
Seminole patchwork. Yeah.
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
American knots and improvisation. So I definitely I want to have you back so that you can talk about those as
Yeah, we can
well.
talk more about aesthetics and what the quilts
Yes. Yeah,
look like.
yeah, absolutely. But
Yeah.
this was amazing. You just you bring a wealth of experience and knowledge, and your passion exudes this
Mm,
knowledge from you in a way that I can absorb it and get excited about it too. And then it's really coming, you know, to the surface on Instagram and everywhere with this mending,
mhm.
visible mending.
I love how
Yeah.
portable it
Yeah,
is.
and portable.
You don't have to be then in your sewing room at home. You can go to a social
Hmm.
gathering. You can be quilting on an airplane. You can be quilting in the waiting room. It you find more times where you could be quilting because the location is so freeing for where
Right.
you can do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. The location and like you said, you just need needle and thread.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing hand quilting with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me on. This was really special talking to you.
Oh, yeah, I was an honor. I really enjoyed having you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Make and Decorate podcast. You can find the show notes and the podcast episodes on my website at stephaniesochadesign.com. And I appreciate any ratings, reviews, and comments that you would like to post and give me feedback on Instagram or wherever you are at. Okay, bye.